I came about this topic in a slightly different way. This is not my main research area, but in 2006, when I got my job at OU, I found myself teaching a course that was not what I had hoped it would be. And as luck would have it, I got an email that said the intersession, which is a short 2-week course between the time the spring semester ends and the summer classes start, someone had dropped out and they needed a class. And so they asked the entire university, could someone just pitch me a class? And I thought, oh, I really need something fun in my life. And so I said, hey, how about a class on humor? And they said, sure, if you can fill it, because we pay you by the student. And so I put flyers all around the campus and I filled up the class. And that started me on my journey thinking about instructional humor and studying humor more seriously. Yes. And so, the literature on instructional humor and humor and pedagogy it's quite expansive, it's complex, it's occasionally conflicting. And I think part of the reason for that is because humor is not monolithic. As several of our speakers have talked about, I'm frequently asked a question, does humor improve advertising? Does humor help relationships? Does humor help solve conflict? Does humor improve education? Well, the answer to almost any social science question is it depends. And the best students, right, can actually answer what it depends on. And it turns out that in humor, one of the keys is that humor has to be appropriate. As Dr. Martin pointed out, the quickest way to lose a class is to make fun of your students, right? To target students for not knowing something, right? We're all here to learn, and not knowing things is one of the reasons why we're students, not professors, right? And professors have things to learn as well. And so, my students sometimes at the end of the section on instructional humor, my students will say, boy, you joke around about a lot of things. Like, what don't you joke about? And there's certain things, there's like those certain lines you don't cross. So, you don't make fun of students for not knowing things. I do not comment on people's appearances. That's another, boy, I must have been laying on this. That's another line that I think is very perilous to cross. But appropriate humor is key. And so today, what I want to talk about, some pretty clear positive outcomes from the research literature, as well as some challenges. And I'll even talk about some of my more recent projects that take pedagogy outside of the classroom. And so let's just talk about the positives of instructional humor. The first and clearest finding in the literature, and the easiest one, as you can imagine, is that humor, appropriate humor especially, has the power to create a warm and enjoyable learning environment. You know that professors oftentimes set the tone for how the class is going to go. And so from day one, by being relaxed and welcoming and willing to joke with your students and be a little bit playful or even silly, right? You can set the tone for what the environment is going to be. And this is the easiest thing to do. And we've seen it right today with how people have presented, right? That thing, even though we're all presenting information via PowerPoint on a stage, it feels very different how people are presenting. The second thing, and Professor Martin pointed this out, right? Appropriate humor increases source liking, right? We enjoy listening and spending time with people we like. This is not particularly revelatory. And one way to do that is through humor. And there's been evidence that appropriate humor increases instructor evaluations. Instructor evaluations are really important for things like promotions, for getting teaching awards. And so this is an avenue to achieve some instrumental goals that matter to students and professors. Now, related to content, if you think about it, it's impossible for anyone to receive messages, understand them, apply them if they don't get in the front door, right? And so one of the things that humor does is that it attracts and focuses attention. And this can be a powerful tool for learning. But you'll notice everything I talked about so far is an indirect effect, right? We're talking about the environment. We're not actually talking about direct forms of learning. So the question is, does humor relate to direct forms of learning? And there's absolutely theoretical ideas, right? Everything here is based on kind of a emotional response theory type of response, right? Which is, emotional response theory is very simple, very basic, right? We are attracted to things we like, and we're repelled by things we don't like. Humor, almost all human beings enjoy laughing, enjoy humor on some level. And so humor has the power to attract. But when we talk about direct effects, we're talking, slightly different theoretical ideas. And one of the things laboratory experiments have shown repeatedly is that humorous information is more memorable when you control for every other factor. We remember things that are funny more than we remember things that are not funny. And so one of the ways this can be directly incorporated into learning is through using humorous examples to illustrate concepts. And so if you're going to use humorous examples to illustrate concepts, you'll also want to test those concepts, right? Those should be concepts that are central to what the lesson plans that you're designing. And so there was a Israeli, rest in peace, but there was this Israeli professor who was interested in humor. His name was Ziv. And he did one of the first and sadly only true field experiments where the first experiment that he did is he took a statistics course and he trained the teacher he looked at lesson plans and he trained the teacher to use 4 jokes per hour. And he had 2 sections in the same semester. And so he trained him on how to, he helped him with his lesson plans, helped him institute these jokes. And what he found was a 10% increase in test scores. But the key is explain the concept, give a humorous example, paraphrase the concept. And then he replicated it with a completely different professor in a psychology class the next semester. Most studies, for example, the studies discussed by Professor Martin, oftentimes those are based on students' perceptions of their own learning, which is a useful outcome variable, but slightly different than an experimental design where you're actually looking at test scores. Now, this has all been rather theoretical. Let's walk through an example, right? Shall we? How this might work, right? So I'll talk about a little communication. Since I'm a communication professor, I'll give you a communication example. So one of the things that early on in communication we learn about the polysemic nature of communication. What does that mean, right? Polysemy, it's a fun word to say, right? It simply means that words and phrases have multiple meanings. They're open to interpretation. We interpret things differently. And so this is a true thing that was said to me by my girlfriend in college. She said to me, "You're the only boyfriend I've ever had that I haven't cheated on." And now how I interpreted that was, wow, what a wonderful relationship we have. I have reformed this wayward woman, right, and brought her in line. Now, when I tell this story, how everyone else interprets it is, oh man, you're going to get cheated on, which is exactly what happened. And so, right, but it's the polysemic nature of communication. I had all the data I needed, right? I mean, I'm a social scientist. I understand the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, right? And yet, I interpreted this phrase. I had all the information I needed, but I interpreted it in a different way. And that happens all the time. Let's have another example. Here's nonverbal communication, right? Dr. Dunbar's specialty. And so one of the things, if you know anything about communication, is verbal and nonverbal communication signals and messages can correspond with each other, right? If you're asking where the bathroom is, where's the closest bathroom? It's that way, right? It is down the hall to the right. And I'm pointing to the right, right? Stage right. No. Is it stage right? I'm not an actor. I always get stage right and stage left wrong. But nevertheless, it's that way, right? That is corresponding. But we know if you have lived your life right? Which most of you don't have to raise your hand, have lived life, right? Up until now, right? You're living so far, right? Then you know that occasionally what you will have happen is verbal and nonverbal behaviors will not correspond. Who here has ever been in a relationship with someone, like a romantic relationship? Yep. Okay, me neither. But if you are, you might imagine, right? You might imagine one of the important things to understand about when verbal and nonverbal communication signals conflict, right? You have to make a choice. Do you go with what is said, or do you go with the nonverbal behavior? And the answer, my friends, is you always go with the nonverbal behavior. You always go with a nonverbal behavior. The nonverbal behavior has more meaning in that situation. And so a great example, if you imagine you were in a romantic relationship, right? Imagine that you are a person in a relationship with this young woman here. And you see her, right, with a scowl on her face, with her arms crossed, and you say, "Hey, is there anything wrong?" And she says, "No." You're like, "Baby, are you sure there's nothing wrong?" I said no. Well, my friend just called me, and we're gonna go watch the NBA playoffs over at their house. Do what you want. Now, a court stenographer, if you read that back, right? It would, is there anything wrong? No. Are you sure there's nothing wrong? No. Well, I'm going to go over to my friends and watch basketball. Do what you want, right? All the verbal indication is you are free to go. However, if the gentleman in this story goes, right, he could very well be murdered. He is in severe danger, right? And so you trust the nonverbals. And communication, one of the reasons I love communication is there are so many fun examples, right, that you can pull from. If your lesson plans are simply verbal and nonverbal communication may conflict, you should trust nonverbal more. Next slide, right? It's a rather boring lesson. And it also isn't, right? You might be asking yourself, well, why is that the case, right? But these examples not only help you understand, right, but then you can start thinking of your own applications. So one of the things that can sometimes, right, we're talking about positives, but we're also talking about challenges, right? So one of the things that frequently people say, well, what if you're not funny, right? What if you're not a funny person? And the key thing to understand, right, is that humor is not necessary for effective pedagogy. As Professor Martin stated, and I 100% believe this, the key, right, to connecting with your students is that they believe you care about them. And if you care about your students, it's oftentimes obvious. Now, humor can oftentimes be a shortcut for bonding, like Professor Dunbar talked about. Laughing together helps bond people together. And if you're not funny, this can be a real issue when you're trying to be funny. Ziv, to paraphrase Ziv, he said there is nothing worse than an unfunny person trying to be funny. And we've all probably experienced that once in your life. Hopefully you're not experiencing that right now. That would be my nightmare if that's what's going through your head. Like, why did we invite this guy? But if you want to take advantage of humor, right, there's other opportunities for you, right? You can incorporate videos, and which I think is a good idea anyways. One of the pieces of feedback I got from my students this year, I spent the past year in the Honors College at the University of Oklahoma. And so I'm teaching the best and the brightest at the University of Oklahoma, overwhelmingly STEM majors. And I had a wonderful experience the entire year. But one of the things that they liked is the multifaceted nature of what we did. And just like, for example, something that came out on my teaching evaluations that I didn't even think about. It just happened. But I don't know if this happens here in Hong Kong, but in America, college campuses are free to the public. And so they tend to outside kind of activists come to our campus. And one of the people who came was a religious woman who basically castigates the students, right? So she basically tells the students they're all going to hell because they're horrible sinners. And so I was teaching a class in conspiracy theories, and I said, hey, let's go talk to her. And so we went and we chatted, and it ended up being humorous. But they really enjoyed that. And I think the same thing with videos and memes, right? There are other ways to incorporate where you can utilize someone else's humorous examples without having to come up with them on your own. A lot of what I've talked about today is from an article that I'm the first author. Professor Dunbar's the second author. It was published in Communication Education in 2011. And I open up with a quote from the show The Simpsons, which was my favorite show when I was younger. But you could absolutely, the same lesson I talked about in terms of nonverbal behavior, you could borrow something similar from The Simpsons. And so here's Homer Simpson giving some sage advice. He says, when a woman says there's nothing wrong, it means everything's wrong. And when a woman says everything's wrong, it means everything's wrong. And when a woman says something's not funny, you better not laugh your ass off. And so, right, I didn't have to write that. That was a Google search. It took me right 5 seconds to find that quote, right? And so you can pull memes, right? And if you know any teenagers, you can just put them on the meme game for you to help integrate other things into your classroom. So let's talk a little bit about using humor beyond the classroom, because I think, right, this conference is about pedagogy. Okay? And I think that teaching happens everywhere. One of the things I teach a class every year in some way, shape, or form, but this past year it's been in the Honors College. It's called The Art and Science of American Humor. And one of the things that we do, the final project for my students, is they have to perform a 3 to 5 minute comedy performance. And in the lead up to that, there is an open mic comedy club on Campus Corner every Tuesday night. Sign up starts at 9:30 p.m. Show starts at 10. And so in the month leading up to our performances, right, we go out and we take in stand-up comedy. And I bring in my comedian friends from the greater Oklahoma metro city area. And they come in and they do their tight five and they do a panel. And it mixes things up. And it shows like Maylee was talking about, the creation. When you create humor, you really learn what it's all about. And you also have a deeper appreciation for just how difficult creating something humorous actually is. And so humor turns out to be a component of every class I teach, but it's also a part of my research program. And so I want to talk a little bit about specifically the study of pedagogy, but also things like reducing prejudice and preventing conspiracy theory endorsement. So I had a student, she was a non-traditional student, an older woman, a little bit older than I am, if you can believe it. And she came to me and she said, hey, because we read my article in class, and she said, I'd like you to come study my gymnastics facility. We're doing something completely different. Instead of an Eastern European model, which is very kind of intimidating, very militaristic, we're trying to lead with positivity and humor. And so what we did is my co-author and I, we went and we observed for a couple weeks the training facility. We interviewed all the athletes, the parents of most of the athletes, and all the coaches. And then we had voice-activated microphones, digital voice recorders that we put on the coaches, and we recorded 2 full weeks of them coaching the athletes. And we have 2 publications that came out of it. And a lot of it confirmed exactly what we've been talking about, right? That humor creates a warm environment that they enjoyed coming to. A lot of the athletes in that gymnastics facility had left the more Eastern European style training facilities because they felt it was too rigid. It was too scary. They didn't feel that they were actually cared for as an athlete and as a person. And also, there was a lot of bonding that happened. Athlete to athlete, a lot of it was essential, that time to joke. And a lot of these are kids, like young kids. And to let kids be kids They felt, and they also felt really bonded to the coaches, right? Just giving each other nicknames or remembering silly things that they had done. One of the things that also emerged that I thought was really interesting too was what withholding humor signaled. And one of the things that you could notice humor was absent when they were doing difficult gymnastics performances, right? The withholding of humor signaled, hey, it's time to be really serious. This is really dangerous. Also, the withholding of humor, right, was a signal that you're not acting appropriately, right? And so it was some real insights. There's a lot on the positive aspects of humor, but I hadn't actually encountered anything about what withholding humor could signal. So that was really interesting. Oh, and this is not one of the athletes. This is a gymnast from UCLA. Now, I have a study. It's under review right now. Hopefully it'll be coming out soon. But it's about the potential of stand-up comedy to reduce prejudice. One of the things in the instructional humor literature, they talk about, well, you want to draw a line between being a professor and being a stand-up comedian. And I think that's actually right. I think that, stand-up comedy routines oftentimes have no boundaries, and they're not really there to make an educational point. But what about stand-up comedy? It's incredibly popular, not only in the United States, but across the world. And what is the potential for stand-up comedy? And so if you think about humor in general from an evolutionary psychology perspective, right? It's about broadening and building, right? Broadening your scope of, your scope of influence, your scope of friends, your network, and also building those relationships. And this is something that's essential for interpersonal relationships. Interpersonal relationships rely on positivity, and humor is a part of that positivity. And so one of the things that happens, one of the ways that prejudice is reduced is through positive contact with others, right? If I am the only white person you have ever met, right? Perhaps as we get to know each other, I can dispel some prejudices that you may have about white people. Now, I understand you live in an incredibly diverse community. I'm not the only white person you've ever met, right? But for a lot of Oklahomans, they don't actually, right? There may not be a lot of diversity and opportunities for them to have interpersonal contact with people that are particularly different from themselves until they get to the college level. And so what we did is we started thinking about during COVID, when everybody was home consuming comedy at an unprecedented rate, I started thinking about what are some of the outcomes that are happening from consuming comedy. And so I started thinking about what modern stand-up comedy is like. And it's much more diverse and personal than it's ever been in the United States. And I also thought it could provide a very clean test of parasocial contact. Right? Parasocial contact is this one-way illusory relationship that you have with a media performer, right? And so there's something called emancipatory ethnic humor, right? And theoretically, what it does is it exposes dominant cultural narratives that perpetuate oppression while presenting counter narratives that would otherwise be suppressed. And so through emancipatory humor, can we reduce prejudice? So what we did is we did an online experiment. We had 4 conditions, 2 Muslim stand-up comics, one of which was Hassan Minhaj, Homecoming King. I don't know if you've seen that comedy special. It's fantastic. I highly recommend it. The other Muslim stand-up comic was Mo Amer, his Vagabond comedy special. Also fantastic. I saw him do that special live, actually, in Oklahoma City. And so we randomly assigned people to 4 conditions, one of the 2 Muslim comic conditions or one of the 2 white comic conditions, a between group design. We measured how funny they thought it was, right? We measured the parasocial relationships they formed between these comics. We measured things like intergroup anxiety, social distance, and outgroup stereotype endorsement were both outcome measures. And they're both extremely similar. And then we had a variety of attention checks and covariates throughout the experiment. And what we found was that, yeah, it worked, right? The watching Muslim stand-up comics had a noticeable, right, and significant and substantial effect on prejudice outcomes. And the key mediator was intergroup anxiety, right? if you're able to see a stand-up comic who's different than you and talks about their experiences, it makes you less afraid of that out-group as a whole. And so there's something really powerful about comedy that can teach us not just about concepts like nonverbal communication and polysemy, right? But can actually also teach us broader ideas about humanity that can reduce prejudice, which there's entirely too much of in this world. And what was cool about the experimental design that we did, where we had other comics as the control groups, is we were able to rule out mirth exclusively as a explanatory mechanism for those effects, which had not been done previously. My main thing that I study is misinformation and conspiracy theories, right? And one of the things that has not really truly been considered, in my opinion, for dealing with conspiracy theories and misinformation is the power of humor, right? And I absolutely 100% believe in the power of absurdity to expose absurdity. Who here has heard of birds aren't real? The conspiracy, birds aren't real. A couple of us. This is a satirical conspiracy theory. Am I running out of time? Is that what you're doing? You're giving me the time? Oh, okay. Okay, sorry. But birds aren't real is a satirical conspiracy theory, and I love it so much. It's the idea that the American government in the late 50s and early 60s eliminated all birds in the United States and replaced them with robots to spy on the American people. And so if you've ever had bird poop on your car, that's actually a tracking device, a liquid tracking device. And so it's silly. And young people, the fun thing too is it reveals so much about conspiracy theories. Young people think it's funny and get it so much more than old people in America. But once you start to understand how silly this conspiracy theory is, right, it should lead you to hesitate, right, to believe in the silliness of other conspiracy theories. And other humorous examples to help to help prevent conspiracy theories. There's a very wonderful finding about Princess Diana conspiracy theories. So I was actually wrapping up college when Princess Diana died, and I was actually surprised at how many conspiracy theories popped up after her death. If you don't know, Princess Diana died in a car accident fleeing the paparazzi. And even though millions upon millions of people die every year in car accidents, right, especially when they're speeding, right, and not wearing a seatbelt, this one, because she's a famous person, conspiracy theories developed. Now, they asked hundreds of conspiracy theorists who believe that there was foul play involved. And what they found was this. There is a substantial positive correlation between two beliefs about Princess Diana, right, related to this conspiracy theory, right? One, she was murdered by the crown, right? The crown, right, the Queen of England was behind her assassination, and it was all a plot to kill her because she was an embarrassment to the royal family. That is significantly and positively and substantially related to this also belief. She's still alive and she's hiding somewhere. Now, just think about that for a split second, right? The more you believe she was murdered, the more you also believe she's still alive, right? And if there is nothing I've encountered in the conspiracy theory literature that displays the lack of consistent logic better than that finding. And I like to share this when I talk to my students about conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories have a logic of their own, but it's not the kind of logic that we teach in college. And then in America, we have this conspiracy theory called QAnon, right? And it's some hodgepodge of a variety of conspiracy theories, but it all centers around the idea that the United States government is run by a secret cabal of Satan worshiping pedophiles. It's very complex and weird. But one of the things that is harmful, in my opinion, is we treat conspiracy theories seriously. And anytime you take something absurd and you treat it seriously, people start taking it seriously. And so there's a comedian named Jim Jeffries. He's extremely irreverent, right? Perhaps don't put on a Jim Jeffries special around your mom. But he's very, very funny. But he has had one of my favorite ways to kind of show the absurdity of this conspiracy theory. He rounded up 4 of the main conspiracy theory influencers in the same room, and he just asked them questions about QAnon. And he didn't argue with them. He didn't try to debunk them. He didn't try to tell them they were wrong. All he did was let them talk. And they all turned on each other, right? And they all started arguing with each other. And it was wonderful. In 4 minutes, I think he did in that 4-minute interview, he did more to show how silly QAnon was than all the mainstream media organizations put together over the past 8 years, right? It's wild, right? And so I absolutely believe that humor can promote critical thinking. And I think media literacy is another part of it, right? Shows like, have you heard of the Daily Show? It's a very popular American comedy program. And it helps. I mean, it's been demonstrated that it helps teach Americans media literacy, which is something that is sorely lacking in America. And so as we come to the end, we have challenge number 2, which is the big one, right? The research on instructional humor is overwhelmingly Western, right? In the article I published in 2011, right, I have a section on culture. And I believe there were 2 citations, right? Now, that study, my study, has been cited 653 times since then. So I know that there's a lot more research out there. And as we've seen today, there's some really impressive, intercultural, cross-cultural research being done. But the vast majority of it is still Western, right? And there's a very prominent Chinese scholar named Zhang who completely disagrees with me about whether this can work in mainstream China. And so there's another Thai researcher who also disagrees with me, and they found that not only can instructional humor not be effective, but it's actively harmful, right? Students don't like it. They don't want in a formal educational setting, right? Humor breaks down that formality, right? And there's also simply not enough scholarship on the hard sciences. One of the things on my own campus when I do talks, not everybody, but occasionally I will have people say, well, humor works great for communication, but it's not, I study organic chemistry, right? It's not going to work for organic chemistry, right? And so I think as we've heard today, I think it takes a little more creativity, perhaps. Maybe it doesn't lend itself as easily, but I definitely believe with some creative thinking and lesson planning and being observant of the world, I think these things can work. But I will just end on this note. I have never been more scared to give a talk in my entire life because of these scholars who were like, yeah, your style of humor will not play in China. And so when I had the opportunity to go to Hong Kong, I had to take it to see how it went. And I was just hoping, I picked this picture. I was just hoping this was not going to be your faces like watching me today. Just like, why? But that is my talk. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions?
Yeah. Do we have any questions from the audience?
There's one.
I have one question. I wonder why the Chinese scholars think that Chinese students are not very interested with humorous classes, because many students pay very high tuition fees to new Oriental English classes to learn English. Actually, they want to hear about like not only English knowledge, but also the jokes from the teachers. And some of my friends were teachers from that organizations. They were trained to remember many jokes, and jokes are flying in class. So I wonder why scholars thought students are so like so intense in the class, or only focused on the knowledge. Okay, that's my
Yeah.
question.
So I mean, I'm with you. My belief is that people are much more alike than they are different, no matter where you go in the world. The very first thing I did after I got off the plane, I met with Alex. We had a nice conversation. He made sure I was very well taken care of. And then I went down to Hong Kong Island and I had a delicious meal and a few cocktails. And I made friends with local Hong Kong people. And we laughed and we shared stories about our life. And we look different. I'm the only gentleman I've seen with a handlebar mustache in Hong Kong so far. But we had a great time. And I think people are more alike than they are different. And I think we all want to laugh. I think with respect to Professor Zhang, their data is why they had the conclusions they had. Now, it's very possible it was a factor of where their data came from. If it came from because I remember years ago, I had some Chinese students and I was teaching an interpersonal communication class, and the textbook had intercultural breakouts for each one. They would talk about how these things work differently culturally. And so I remember these two lovely Chinese women, and I would say, hey, is anyone else from a different culture who could maybe speak to how this might work in a different culture? And they didn't raise their hand. And so after class, I was like, hey, do you think you could answer? And they were like, oh, well, where the school I come from in China, students don't talk in class. They listen in class. Professors talk, students listen. And I'm like, I totally understand that. I mean, it hasn't been my experience. I'm not Chinese. But maybe we do it the American way here. Like, just role play that you're an American, sharing your knowledge, because we're going to learn a lot from you, right? And they warmed up, and the class learned a lot about what it was like, because the whole class, except for those two women, were all white American students, primarily from Oklahoma and Texas. And so we learned so much. But I'm with you. I think that this can work. And as we've seen, right, we've heard from Hong Kong professors, right, who use humor in their classroom. I've never believed that this is an exclusively Western phenomenon. So I agree with you. Good. Anyone else?
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I just want to add a thought partly on the same question, which I don't know how you would think about it, which is, I think humor part of the reason why in Chinese or Asian classrooms, the humor question could fall differently is because of the leveling effect of the power difference between the instructor and the students, because a lot of times in the Hong Kong classroom, there's a sort of like fear to cross the line of the authority of the instructor, and then so for the instructor who's trying to eliminate that and be like, no, just ask me questions. Don't be afraid to ask me anything. Just speak, right? The useful thing to me about humor is that it breaks that down.
Absolutely.
But then for some instructors and some students, like, that line is still very important. Like,
yeah.
They don't want to cross that line, and then humor sort of like messes it all up.
Yeah. And it's also not transportable, right? So my father-in-law is Russian, right? Russia is an extremely high power distance culture. I was able to give a talk at Kuban State University, and it was wild. Students parted the sidewalk when he walked to class. I mean, I don't get that kind of respect on my campus, right? Like, I mean, I might step into a muddy grass so some sorority girls can walk by, right? Like, it was amazing, the power distance. And power distance is a very real phenomenon, and it's very prevalent in Asia, right? I mean, Malcolm Gladwell's book about the Korean theory of plane crashes, right? Because, you know, when you have that many levels of politeness, it's hard for a co-pilot to correct a pilot, right? So it absolutely makes a difference. And humor can break that down. But then when you go to your next class, right? So I don't even have my students call me professor. Everyone on campus calls me Banas. I'm the only Banas in the state of Oklahoma besides my children, right? And so you just call me Banas. And so everybody calls me Banas. And sometimes like when my football players, their academic advisor will say, "Oh, you address them as Professor Banas," and they're like, and I always tell them, it's fine. You know, we know each other. And then I tell them, you can call me Banas too. But I agree, humor can break that down, and that's, for me, that's really important, because sometimes students, I look a certain way, and it can be intimidating. And I don't want that. I want my students to be able to talk to me, all the things that Dr. Martin talked about, talking to me after class, right? Or saying hi to me at a restaurant instead of, being like, "Oh, my professors are," like you can come over and say, "Oh, hey, how are you doing?" Right? I enjoy that. I want us to be a community of learning. And the other thing about humor, in terms of appropriateness, we can create anything we want, right? Humor shapes reality. Reality can shape how we talk, but it works the other way, right? I mean, you would be shocked at some of the things that we do in class. Now, granted, I teach a class on humor. And so some of the things we watch are wild. But some people say I can't, like no swearing. I swear a lot. But it's because we create that thing. And we create it from the first day. In my humor class, the very first thing I do in my humor class, after we do introductions, I say, "What can't we joke about? Like, what can't we joke about?" And I read it on the board, but I've been doing this for years. And so all I have loaded up on my computer are jokes about everything we said. And so you might say, "Well, we can't joke about disabilities." And so, yeah, that's great. And I write it down, and then I play a stand-up clip or a comedy skit about disabilities. And then I notice you're laughing, and I say, well, why were you laughing? I thought you said we can't joke about disabilities. And then you say, well, they're not making fun of disabled people. They're making fun of how people are awkward around disabled people. And I say, okay, so what's the lesson? And we talk about authorship, and we talk about targeting, and we talk about just what's the premise of the joke, right? Is the premise smart? And then we kind of create some rules, some ground rules on how to get down. And we're not limited anymore by topic, right? We're limited by cleverness, wit, right? And making sure we're not punching down, we're not re-victimizing people. And it's a different way to see the world, because there are so many people that, like, they're nervous about humor instead of understanding the power of what it can do for you. Great. Am I out of time, Alex?
Do we have any more questions? Right. Yeah. It's from Mei Lee. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. And I'll be around later, and I'll tell you how to get a nice curl in your mustache.
If we have one. Yeah, thank you so much. I learned so much. I was particularly drawn to the slide on the stand-up comedy. Yeah, because when I was preparing for my presentation, I read about this incongruity theory, and it's researching on comedians, and then but I thought, like, wow, this is quite applicable even in instructional humor. So what my question is, what is some of the similarities and differences of a stand-up comedy and instructional humor, and what's some examples?
Part of it is performative, right? I think you need a certain, like, your energy is fantastic. Like, I want to be your student, right? I just like the way you present. And it's the same thing with comics, right? not to get morbid, but my father died of cancer 5 years ago. And I went from his funeral and I had to go teach a class on humor. Like that flew on a Sunday in class on a Monday. And we have to do performances, right? And so I'm taking my students to the comedy club. And I remember walking into the comedy club and I was in a haze. And as I'm walking, I'm like, I can't tell jokes like this. And as I was walking, I chin up and I just put on the character of the person who's going to tell jokes that night. And it was a very aggressive set, right? I grabbed the mic and I'm like, all right, let's do this. And I just started going. And it was great. It worked out great. But part of it is the performance. But incongruity theory, there's a variety of theories, right? I mean, there's a dozen comedy theory or humor theories. Incongruity theory is the one. Every joke incorporates incongruity. It has to be. There has to be incongruity, right? Or there's no joke, right? This bisociation, right? Like when people say the wrong thing, or they have a double meaning, double entendres, right? Why do we snicker sometimes when someone says something? Because they're not hearing, right, what they're saying, right? In America, we a lot of times will be like phrasing, or they'll just get something just a little bit wrong, right? So I remember there was these expressions in the 90s. We used to tell people, hey man, chill out. Or then there was a variation called, hey man, take a chill pill. And one time I was frustrated about something and my dad just got it wrong. He goes, hey man, take a chill out pill, which was just wrong enough that it just made me laugh so hard, right? But just incongruity, saying the wrong thing. There's a joke in America. There's a comedy troupe called Key and Peele, and they have a joke about Black Republicans. And it's very very precious to me. It's an inside joke between me and my wife. And so I introduce my students at the end of the year. I do that bit. We watch it in class, and then I do that bit. But I never do it for my Black students. I only do it for like my white and my Asian students. But when I bring them up, right? Like if you were kind of Mei Lee, I'd be like, oh, our next performer, you're in for a treat. She's a little bit eccentric. She's a little bit outside of the box, if you will. But I can't think of a better speaker to talk about the diversity of Black Republicans than Mei Lee. And it makes no sense, right? It's completely incongruous. But because we have that background that we've built up, right? But the thing is, I don't just do it for one student. I do it 5 times in a row. And so it's ridiculous. It's absurdity on top of absurdity. And it just becomes incongruous. And then the 6th time, they expect me to do it for the 6th student, and I don't. I do a normal one. And so, but incongruity, right? You make people, right? Comedy is about making people think you're going to zig, but then you zag, right? And also, there's all sorts of things that add to it. The arousal, talking about things you shouldn't talk about, right? That's part of the fun, I did a joke on stage to be totally irreverent. We'll just do it, and then I'll hand off the mic. But there's only 2. I'm a full professor. There's only 2 things I can do to get fired, right? And that is fight my students or have a romantic relationship with my students. That's it. Those are the only 2 things that can get me fired. Nothing else. Nothing else. And so I said on stage, I opened up with that. And I said it a little more irreverently, right? Said there's only the 2 F's are the things I can't do with my students, right? And I said, and that's a shame because, I mean, let's be quite honest, right? Looking around this room, there are several students I would like to fight to the death, right? And then I just made up this, but they're all my students. These are all my students in the comedy club, and they were terrified that I was going to say the other thing, right? And right, but I knew that's where it was going, right? You set it up, and then you pull the rug out, and that's all comedy works like that. All right, well, thank you.